All right. Hello, everybody. Okay, so today I think we're going to talk about um, Grid and Flexbox. So somebody asked me last night, what's the difference between Grid and Flexbox? And I said, Grid is a table but better, and Flexbox is a series of inline block items but better. And I think that is the most ridiculously succinct, incorrect, and yet not wrong explanation that I could possibly have come up with in 2 sentences. Um, but let's see if I can actually answer the question. So, um, my portfolio and the powerful thing about Grid and Flexbox is actually when you start nesting them. But let's start with um, Grid. A lot of tutorials start with Flexbox, and I think that's just because the people writing the tutorials started with Flexbox, and so it makes sense to them. That's what they learned first, so that's what they're going to teach first. And if you go back far enough, that's because Flexbox was added to the CSS specifications before Grid was. That's not a great reason. It may or may not be the correct answer, but it's not a good reason necessarily. Sometimes the order that things got added to the specifications does make sense to teach in that order because they actually build on each other. Grid and Flexbox were proposed at the same time. They just one of them got actually built first, as far as I can tell. It doesn't matter. Um, and weirdly for me, Grid makes more sense than Flexbox. But then again, I learned tables first. Uh, Back in the good old days, we could do some crazy things with tables that would probably make accessibility people faint these days. But it was fun. And now we have Grid, which lets me do the same kind of weird, fun things, which is fantastic. So I have the main thing establishing the layout of my portfolio site here is this grid. It is a 3-column, 1-row, effectively table. Grids are, you got rows, you got columns. And because it's only 1 row, you could conceivably do this with Flexbox. It would be, you could have um, the first item being a fixed width, and then the other two items being able to grow and shrink with the size of the grid. Um, but it's this particular layout doesn't have a lot of, it collapses down into one column if you've ever tried looking at it on mobile really fast. Like it's not that responsive of a width. Like once you get wide enough to show it as the sort of binder view, it doesn't then keep getting bigger, for example. But there's, a few pixels of adjustments that it'll accommodate. Um, you know, because you can create a flex box and tell it not to do a lot of growing and shrinking and stuff and moving around. But with Flexbox, if you wanted to say, this first column is always this width, this, then that would have to be a div that on the div you specify that it's not allowed to grow and it's not allowed to shrink and it has this width, right? Whereas with grid, on the grid you say the first column's this way. End of story. and then you just drop a div in there. And the divs, automatically go max width. That width is constrained by the grid. Um, that sort of thing. And then, in fact, on the grid, you can say, by the way, if I drop a div in here, make it full height, make it align top, make it align bottom, make it align center. And you can specify that on the grid, and it'll apply to like all of the cells in your grid. And then if you want an exception, you can apply it to the individual items in the cells of the grid. So I've used grid for this. And then this left-hand page of the portfolio here is another grid. And, as you can imagine, if I tried to make this entire page laid out with one grid and, then the list of navigation tabs on the right would then have to be like, I'm going to span 5 columns and then, whatever, right? So no, so we have one nested inside of the other. Where in the stats row for each of the categories, I've got a Flexbox. So this Flexbox, I'm using Flexbox because I want it to be a little bit flexible. As you notice that it's not a fixed number of columns. For most categories, it's got 5 columns because it's got three things of content and 2 dividers. And down here for the redirect form, it's got actually maybe 3 columns. So the Flexbox will just say, however many columns fits, however many stuff we have, that's how many columns we've got. When you start using Flexbox wrap, that's when they really start behaving just like inline block elements. But if you say, okay, I've got a Flexbox, it's a single row, however many things I've got, make them fit somehow, right? And then you can do align center. You can tell it whether you want things to stretch or, have space around them or everything crowded towards the center or whatever. So whether an item is allowed to stretch or not is set on the item or shrink. And then whether Flexbox is going to try and stretch them or shrink or not is set on Flexbox. It'll always try and shrink them if Flexbox can't fit them all, it'll try and shrink them unless you have Flexbox wrapped or not, right? So yeah, so Flexbox decides whether it's going to try and grow or shrink things to fit. And then each individual item, you can tell it whether or not it's allowed to. And the default is that it will shrink, but it won't grow, which leads to some weird behavior sometimes. Often you'll end up changing that. Whereas with grid, the grid has a little bit, like the grid is more in control of where your columns are. Also with Flexbox, if you do have it set to wrap, the items on the second row won't necessarily line up with the items on the first row. Like it won't form neat columns unless all of the items are the same width to start with. Which is very much like inline block. In terms of code, let me pull this in here. All right, so the stats row of this forum category here. It's the exact same code to get this one on the redirect forum and the one up above on the regular categories. They're exactly the same code. And I've said what the height is. I've said display flex. I've said align item center. That's your vertical align. If I'd set this up as a grid, it would just either expand out into the margin if it was overflow show, or it would, and you can set up the grid so that it, with auto width, which means that it just fits the content, and you'd end up with this sort of thing. But for the most part, the effective use of grid, unless you have you want like an actual table set up, where you want rows and columns, but you don't care how big the columns are, you just want everything to sort of line up neatly, then you can just use auto width all over the place. But the effective use of auto width is for that responsive width thing, where you're like, okay, I want this column to be a fixed width because it's my menu, and I want it to be exactly the same size on every page because otherwise it'll look weird. And then, on the right-hand side, maybe you've got like some call-out boxes, some whatever, beside your content, more information stuff. And you're like, okay, sometimes the image is at a different size. I don't want too much white space around that. I want that to actually be the size of whatever that content is that I'm putting in there, that aside. And then, so that'll be auto. And that means like whatever the width of the thing is. And then everything in the middle will take up the rest of the space, which you use with FR units. That may also be why people don't start with grid, because you don't have to talk about FR units. Auto is the size of the content. And if there's like extra space between when you add up the size of all your content and the actual width of the column of the grid, it'll sort of grow those columns sort of proportionally. Whereas if you want your columns to be equal width, regardless, you want them to be flexible, you want them to be, whatever's appropriate for the screen size, but you want your columns to be equal width, you'd use FR columns, or FR units. FR units are similar to percentage units. They're more similar to percentage units than to something like auto. I believe it stands for something like fill remaining or whatever. The people who come up with this are very technical people, and that results in some weird acronyms sometimes. We love them. We love them. Anyways, I should do a stream on units. Like, just on units. It'd fill an hour. Maybe it's fill ratio. So the thing about percentage is, if you want, let's say you want 3 equal width columns, right? In like a traditional table, HTML table, right? You'd say column 1, 33%, column 2, 33%, column 3, 33%. And then that only adds up to 99%, and the browser kind of just distributes the other percent equally, and you end up with 3 equal width columns. If you want one column that's a fixed width, like your menu, and then you want a 2-column layout, and those 2 columns are equal to each other, right? Then you're like, okay, the fixed width one is going to be, 200 pixels, or you could use ems or something relative. The first one's going to be 200 pixels, and then the second column and the third column are going to be let's say, play around with some numbers on my monitor, what looks good, 40%. So you have 200 pixels, 40%, 40%. If your thing is 800 pixels wide, did I do my math right? Anyway, there's a lot of math. I could just use calc. CSS will do math for me. I don't like doing math. I like letting the computer do the math. It's better. So I can say, okay, first column is 200 pixels wide. Second column is, we're going to calculate our 100% minus 200 pixels, which is the remaining space, and then divide all of that by 2. And put that on the 2 remaining columns. And then you'll have 2 equal width columns. With grid, you can just say, okay, first one is 200 pixels. Second column is 1 FR. Third column is 1 FR. FR is calculated last. It will calculate the widths of all of your other columns. It will take the remaining space and it will divide them up according to how many FRs each column has. So if you have one column that's 1 FR and another column that's 1 FR, those 2 columns will always be the same width regardless of what size your grid ends up with because of your screen size or whatever, after sort of everything else is sorted out. If you have one column that's 1 FR and one column that's 2 FR, the 2 FR column will always be exactly twice the width of the 1 FR column. You don't have to do the math, and you don't end up with sort of weird rounding errors that you get if your pixels and your percentages don't add up to 100%. So that's useful. Let me take a look at this. Grid here, and we can see. So I've got display grid. I've got justify content space between. So that there isn't actually any space between these, because of the way that I've set the widths, they will always take up all of the space required. But space between, I set it to space between just in case. So if there are any like weird 1 pixel rounding errors, or if there are, if I think I was playing with some other column options earlier, the leftmost column will be all the way to left, the rightmost column will be all the way to the right. Everything else will sort of be like arranged in the middle. Your other options for justify content are things like center, where everything sort of crowds towards the center, and any unused spaces on the outside. Start, and then there's space around and space evenly, which sort of like shuffle things around. The nice thing about developer toolbar is you can just kind of like go here. If you just put your cursor in there with nothing in there, it'll show you what your options are. Now, some of these are not really options. Things like normal and revert and initial and are sort of default options that are available in the spec. They are available for every single CSS rule, and most of them mean whatever the browser wants to do, basically. Um, if you're not dealing with variables, so maybe I'll go over this in the variables one. Revert and initial are sort of the same. Um, safe and unsafe for new. I actually don't know what those do. I'll go look it up if I care. But flex and are synonyms for each other. Flex start and start are the synonyms for each other. The keywords when Flexbox and grids first came out, the keywords for Flexbox and grid alignments were different, and then someone realized that was dumb because they do exactly the same thing almost. And if they don't, it's really obvious what you mean because you're either applying it to a grid or a Flexbox. So now they're just considered synonyms for each other. You can use either one on either thing. Some super old browsers are gonna get confused with that. Most browsers now auto update, so you only really need to worry about going back a couple of things. If you have like one person who's complaining, then figure out which browser they're using as usual, but don't worry too much. Um, yeah, I can't really show you what they do on this because like I said, there's no actual extra space to play around with. But here's my grid template columns. So I've said the first column's for M. I used M so that if somebody zooms the font size rather than just the entire page, it'll still, be that the space in the sort of portfolio background image, which isn't really a background image, but that's sort of like, you know what I mean? The space allotted to that column is like twice the tab height, and the tab height looks good on whatever font size they've adjusted their font size on their computer to. I try and do most things in M's that are like container sizes, or percentages or whatever makes sense to sort of. The more you can make the computer do the math, the easier your life is. Yeah, pixels make your life harder, kids. But then I said the right-hand column is always 50%, right? Which makes sense with the design that I'm trying to do, right? I'm trying to make it look like a, physical binder. So that center seam is always going to be in the middle of the full object, right? So I don't want that to be half of the remaining space. I want that to be half of the full space of the full width. So that right-hand page is 50%. And then this left-hand area, the sort of second column, is 1 FR, which means, because that's the only FR width, it just means everything else. And then going over here I have justify items center, which you'd be like, that's not center. That's like space between. That gutter's in the middle. Well, that's actually because I have a gap specified. So I said there's one M between the columns. So that's one line height, basically. Like if you look at the height of the text. So again, I've said that I don't think I've even specified a number of columns in here. How the heck did I do that? I just So anyway, if you don't specify a number of columns or a number of rows, it just goes auto. Um, if you put items into a column that doesn't exist in the grid template, it'll just add that column with the width of auto. Same with rows. And if there are more items than spaces in your and you haven't told it where to put it, you just told it to just put it somewhere. I haven't specified a place where to go. It'll start adding rows rather than columns, which kind of makes sense. You can tell it to do it to add columns instead. It's complicated, but that's okay. So I've got padding on the grid itself. So that's the purple there before any of the content shows up. And then I've got the gap, which is these dashed bits. And then the column widths are all auto. And the items inside are divs, which means at least some of these are like, take up as much space as I've got. So then the columns end up, like, you can tell that they're not quite 50%. Like this business card looking thing is wider than the wallet thing. So they end up kind of juggling around like that. It looks a little bit more organic. I like it. I don't want to specify things too hard. Just like make things kind of like look normal, like natural. But for my grid template rows, I did say I want 3 rows that are just whatever's needed auto. So however much space is needed to fit the items, you're going to fit the items. And then the last one is 1FR. Right? So what that means is effectively, so I could have said, so I didn't want the first the 3 rows to be stretching. Like, I didn't want this, like the first cell to be taller than it needed to be. Because I didn't want there to be more than 3 ems of space between the business card and the cell phone looking thing. So I could have said, you know, we're going to align items, vertically align all of the cells, like at the top of the grid, and then there'd be a bunch of white space at the bottom. But I don't really want that. I want the first 3 columns to be pushed to the top of the screen, right? And only take up as much space as they need to, and don't add extra padding or anything weird like that. And then the bottom thing to be at the bottom of the page. And again, on this resolution at this size of whatever, it's not super obvious. I wonder if I can make it. Right? Like, okay, there you go. There you can see what I've done, right? So I said the bottom cell is going to take up as much space as it possibly can and shove everything else up to the top. But then the actual vertical alignment of the stuff inside that bottom cell is at the bottom. So visually what that means is that last gap can grow, but the other ones can't. Is there a different combination of rules that could give the same visual effect? Probably. That's the way I did it. I will link you guys. I'll toss in a link to my favorite resource that, like, because I have most of this memorized. I do not have every single grid rule, every single Flexbox rule memorized. There's a really nice tutorial that I found online that that does everything with like diagrams that explains what every rule is, and I will link you guys to that resource. I will put that in the Discord when we're done here. What I've found is that when you're sketching out a design, when you have it in your head what you want it to look like, and if you're trying to figure out whether you should be doing it with Flexbox or with Grid or with um, just with some floats and stuff or some inline blocks or whatever, um, honestly, like just sketch it out, take a colored pencil, draw in your lines, draw in your boxes, something like this. I've got some lines here. You can tell what's supposed to be lined up with what. So this farm route, like I didn't, it looks kind of grid-ish. I could have thrown up a grid. Um, it's with the way I've done the borders and stuff, it looks like a grid, except it's not, right? Like you actually look at this, like the first row columns, the first row line doesn't line up with the second row line, doesn't line up with the third row vertical, like the third row divider line. Like I could make it into a grid and then say like the first row spans 2 columns and the second row, like this title spans 2 columns, and then on the second row, like the bug fixes thing, like the sub forums thing spans 2 columns, and then like, nah, I didn't bother. Icon, float right, title, it's a row. Second row, that's your second row. It's just a box straight across. Gave it the class wrap floats, which this is one of my favorite tricks. Wrap floats after, clear both. Basically, you're saying that like at the end of this box, there's a thing that takes up 0 space, but is below any floated elements. And that forces this box to expand to fit any floated elements. Because normally a floated element can drop down below the bottom edge of the box that it's contained in. So this fixes that. And then the subforms are float right. And then this bottom row is Flexbox, so that it will usually be about thirds, and then like with a little bit of flex. This down here, you can tell that it's float because it's not set to, like, it doesn't extend the whole height. I could have done it with like that row being a flex box, or even a grid, and like the first column takes up as much space as possible, and the second column is auto. But in this particular case, that was easier, especially since some might not have, right? So you'd have an empty second column, which is fine. It would be 0 pixels. You gotta figure out what you're doing with that dividing line, because that's a left border. Getting a vertical dividing line in the middle of a gap in a flexbox or a grid is basically, visually you can do it, it's very hard. It's not, like there's no code that you can say that says, hey, there's a column line, but also like there's an internal border, right? You got your border left, your border right, border top, border bottom in CSS. There's no CSS for like internal border that like is centered on the column gaps or the row gaps. Um, it's been proposed a couple times. There are some workarounds where like instead of having a gap, you just do things with like margins on the elements itself. And so instead of having like a 1 em gap, you'd have the left things have half an em right margin and the right things are padding, and then you put the border. It gets messy, but it can be done, so it hasn't been a high priority for anybody to push for it to be added to the spec to do internal margins on like grids. Maybe one day, maybe not. Who knows? Hard to tell. Yeah. So like, you draw out your thing, and then you take a colored pencil or whatever, and you say, okay, everything, like you extend all of these lines top to bottom, you know, like the full height. If you've got things that are lining up this way, you got like how many things are going to have to span multiple columns or multiple rows? Does it make sense to actually put it as a grid? Is there, like, for what I've got on the left hand side here, like things don't really line up, right? Like there's not, like I've got those two columns, but then I could do that with like nested Flexbox, have some vertical Flexbox. You can have Flexbox do vertical as well as horizontal. Flex direction column. Again, lovely tutorial. I will link you to it later. Um, I could do a Flexbox for each column and then like figure out how to. But in action, like for this one, I was like, okay, no. Yeah, it's gonna be weird. I'm gonna have a lot of things that have to fit into multiple boxes. But oh, by the way, so that's the other thing with Flexbox. Like things go in order. You can specify an order, but they go in order. So by default, they just go in whatever order they're in the source code. And you can specify an order. That's how I do the resorting on like the character directory and stuff like that. But with grid, you can actually specify exactly where things go. So you can end up with like empty cells in your grid. You can end up with things taking up more than one cell. So for example, this one, let me close that. Shoutbox wrapper. That's the one that's actually in the grid. So 20em position relative. Grid column 1, span 1. So I'm saying it's going to start in the first column, and it's going to be one column wide. Grid row 2, span 2. So it's going to start in the second column. Let me turn this back on. Sorry, it's going to start in the second row. There's going to be 2 rows tall. You can also specify grid column start and grid column end. This is just a shorthand with grid column and then the slash. So grid column start 1, grid column end can be one of 2 ways of saying it, right? Grid column end can be a span, right? Because maybe you don't even care which column it is, right? You're just like, I'm doing a photo gallery thing, and my, a square image is gonna take up 1 row and 1 column, like it's gonna take up a single cell. If it's a landscape image, it's gonna take up 2 cells horizontally, and if it's a portrait image, it's gonna take up 2 cells vertically, but you don't care where on your like mood board it is, right? So you could have like a portrait image class that has grid row and span 2, and that says like wherever it is on the grid, I don't care. I haven't specified a start point for it, but I want it to take up two columns or two rows, depending. Or you can specify exactly where you want it to start and end. So, for example, okay, so this one I just said span 2. Okay, I had to do that because I haven't specified template rows. So you can't, like, if I change this, if I said span 3, that's forcing this grid to be a 3-column grid. Which is then like adding this extra gutter here, all that stuff. So sometimes the temptation is to be like span 99, because if you like in a HTML table, if you tell it like call span 99 and there are not 99 columns in the table, it'll just span whatever there are. That doesn't work with grid. It will force it to have that many columns with that much gap space. The other thing that you can do is -1. You can number the columns in reverse as well. So the last column is -1. However, I didn't template my columns. So it's -1 is not the last column in the grid, it's the last column set by the grid template. Like this second column here was automatically generated because I have items that say, hey, I want this in the second column. And the default grid template only has 1 column in it. But it's like, okay, well, tack on some extra columns outside of the template, which is, again, something that HTML tables really don't do. However, if I did template them, and I said we're going to have grid column, grid template columns, we're going to have 2 auto columns, which is basically what it automatically came up with eventually. But now that -1 is actually coming out to the back end because the -1 column is the rightmost column of the template, and that is now the actual rightmost column. Now, that gets complicated. In the Layout tab of Developer Toolbar, display line numbers. Super useful. That's the other thing. So this is the other reason that I like using spans and not specifying with the grid areas, like specifying which columns I am in explicitly, even if I've specified the step column explicitly. So like, because actually it's not the columns that are numbered. It is the grid lines. So if I want, so grid row start for the shout box cell phone looking thing, I said 2, right? And I'm like, okay, because I want it to start in the second row. But I'm not actually starting it. It's not saying exist in the second row. It's saying start at this edge. This line, which is 3 ems tall because I told it to have a gap. This line number 2, that's where the top of the shout box is going to be. And then it's going to span 2 rows, is what I've said. Right? So if I had specified it with just a start number and an end number, I would end in 4. Right? Which doesn't, right? You're like, okay, you start in row 2. You're stretching through row 3. So therefore the row end number is 4. thinking in cells is a lot easier for me than thinking in lines. But if you're going to specify things explicitly rather than relatively with span, you have to think in lines. So here you've got the counting down from the top, 1, 2, 3, and then on the right-hand side, you've got counting up from the bottom, -1, -2, -3. So you can specify a start or an end either with the counting from the start numbers that are positive or the counting from the bottom numbers, from the end numbers, which are the so the display line numbers thing is like, yeah. Extend lines infinitely is useful if you either have like a tiny little grid and it's like really hard to see what's going on. Or if you have like 2 grids on your page and you're trying to make sure that they line up somehow, or you want to make different things on your page line up with each other. For the most part, I find that that's distracting. If I wanted things to line up really well with each other, I would probably put them in the same grid, unless that was completely impractical for whatever reason, because they're coming out of different templates or something. Who knows? And then area names are um, area names are good if you need, like, if you absolutely need breakpoints. I did use them on one other one. Maybe I'll take a break and then come back with that example, just to go over area names. And maybe some more Flexbox examples with like flex reverse or flex flex wrap and stuff, those sorts of examples. Or I could split that into a different stream. I will return to this topic again in the future.